In my humble opinion, Teddy Roosevelt is the most complex president we've ever had. Everyone has reasons that they love Teddy. If you don't, you just haven't learned enough about him yet. And also, everyone has reasons that they probably hate Teddy too. So let's get into his life and his legacy beyond the hero worship stories about saving bear cubs and giving speeches with a bullet lodged in his chest. I mean, it was pretty bad. As we saw last episode, reformers and journalists helped things progress in the progressive era. But the real changes came because we elected presidents who also believed in a strong national government. The three progressive presidents, Teddy, Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, are really the first modern presidents. By the way, Woodrow Wilson's first name was actually Thomas, and I will never forgive him for going by his middle name, because now I can't list out the three progressive presidents as Teddy, Taft, and Thomas. Rude. Before 1900, the federal government was mostly concerned with taxes, tariffs, and war. Most things that impacted people's daily lives were left up to employers or local government, but all of that changed with Teddy Roosevelt. And let's just get this out of the way, I do kind of love Teddy Roosevelt. Like, someone tell me in the comments how many episodes already have gotten a Teddy shout out. It's a lot, and I'm not done. But I love Teddy because he's kind of a modern Renaissance man. He's like the Ron Swanson of American history. Yes, he hunted and went on safaris and traipsed around Latin America telling them what to do, but then he advocated for universal healthcare, social safety nets, and environmental activism. Oh yeah, and he was into women's suffrage like before it was cool. More on that later. He's confusing and I find him fascinating. So who is Teddy Roosevelt? Well, for one, his nickname growing up was TD. Apparently he hated the nickname Teddy, but I refuse to say TD any more than I have to, so sorry, it's Teddy. He was born in New York City to wealthy Theodore Roosevelt Sr. Oh my god, it's like they refuse to accept normal nicknames for Theodore. His mother, Martha Mittie Bullock, was a Southern belle who was rumored to have been the inspiration for Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. His family is cartoonishly legendary. Teddy was incredibly bright, partly bolstered by the fact that illness and asthma kept him inside reading books most of the time. His doctors told him when he was young that to survive, he would need to avoid a strenuous life, and Teddy was like, okay, sounds good, and then ignored that advice completely. He graduated with honors from Harvard in 1880, spent some time at Columbia Law School, but then dropped out to join the New York State Assembly. You know, like you do. He became the youngest person to serve as a New York representative at age 24. But in 1884, he had the worst Valentine's Day ever when his mother and his wife both died on the same day. He left New York behind and spent 2 years as a cowboy and cattle rancher in the Dakota Territory. It's like when Ron Swanson heard Tammy was in town and grabbed his go bag and left for the woods. After his time out west, he came back, lost the race for mayor of New York City, married his childhood friend. They had apparently watched Abraham Lincoln's funeral procession out of the window of his grandfather's house in New York City when they were little together. Cute. He rose up through the civil service in New York City, eventually becoming police commissioner. Remember the Gilded Age episodes? He was convinced by his friend photographer Jacob Riis to improve conditions for the poor. He then became assistant U.S. Navy secretary under President McKinley. Remember the Imperialism episodes? He micromanaged his boss, who then gladly released him to join the Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War. Fresh off his self-imposed glory and fame, that same year he was nominated for the Medal of Honor and elected governor of New York. 1898 was a bad year for the Spanish, but a really good year for Teddy. He was incredibly progressive as governor, so much so that the Republican Party bosses, who were used to controlling city politics Gilded Age style, were like, let's get this guy out of here. And what do you do with a politician so that he will have absolutely no power and nothing to do? Well, you make him vice president, of course. And absolutely nothing could go wrong with this plan. And then President McKinley was assassinated. Whoops. So in 1901, at 42, Teddy became the youngest ever president after McKinley's assassination. And real quick, why was McKinley assassinated? To oversimplify, he was killed by an anarchist who saw the injustice and inequality of the late 19th century and blamed the entire structure of American society and government. His choice of a target was really less about the person and more about the position of the presidency. As an anarchist, he wanted to disrupt and potentially upend the entire US government, and this assassination was a statement against all corruption in the federal government. McKinley was kind of just the president at the exact wrong time, and Teddy was vice president at kind of the exact right time. Now, it's really fitting that Teddy became president in 1901, the beginning of a new century, because Teddy really became the model of a 20th century president. Remember that up until this point, most people, presidents included really believed the federal government was meant to stay out of people's lives and stick to taxes, tariffs, and wars. But a new batch of presidents, known as the progressive presidents, believed that the position was the steward of the people and that he should take action for the public good, now whatever that meant to him. For Teddy, that meant that the American people deserved a square deal that included fair play in the economy, protections for consumers from big corporations, and conservation of natural resources. And boy, did he deliver. He earned the nickname of a trustbuster for actually enforcing the Sherman antitrust law and investigating and holding accountable corporations through his new Department of Commerce and Labor. The Expedition Act, expedited this process by allowing his attorney general to quickly bring antitrust lawsuits on behalf of the federal government, and the ICC began to actually set railroad rates to make sure they were fair for consumers. Like I mentioned last episode, after reading Upton Sinclair's book, he passed the Meat Inspection Act, which inspects meat, I assume? I don't know, I've never looked into it, but the title seems pretty self-explanatory. And he also passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which among other things established the FDA. You know, the people who regulate what we put in our bodies and make sure that food marked gluten-free doesn't secretly have gluten floating around in there, or whatever gluten is. Now, Teddy is probably most remembered for his environmental conservation. In 1906, he signed the National Monuments Act, which protected sites like the Grand Canyon, preserving wildlife sanctuaries, national forests, and game reserves. He created the U.S. Forest Service, protecting 100 million acres of national forest, and he improved federal irrigation projects. Teddy and all of the progressive presidents did a lot of good. I mean, if you think basic protections for consumers, letting women vote, and environmental conservation are good, and if you don't, then what are you doing here? But remember that the progressive era is also the era of imperialism for the United States, especially in Latin America. In the wake of the Spanish-American War, Teddy, Taft, and Wilson all viewed Latin America as our own personal playground. Teddy famously argued that we should speak softly and carry a big stick, a philosophy that led us to incite and support a Panamanian rebellion against Colombia, then get the new tiny country of Panama to sign a treaty with us, letting us build a canal, control the canal, and make money off the canal for the next 100 years. It was a pretty sweet deal, for the United States. Teddy also expanded on the Monroe Doctrine. You know, when Monroe in the early 19th century was like, hey, Europe, stay out of the Americas. I think that's a direct quote. Well, TR went one step further, adding, yeah, and if anyone needs to intervene in Latin America, it's going to be us. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine was basically our new foreign policy stance, that it was our duty to step into any Latin American country when there was, quote, chronic wrongdoing. What does that mean? Well, officially it meant that we saw it as our duty to make sure the Americas were stable. And if the government of a Latin American country was impotent and unable to provide stability for their people, well, we'd do it for them. You're welcome. In practice, we intervened for the sake of stability much more readily whenever our capitalist business interests were threatened. Throughout the Progressive Era, banana republics were established across Central America as U.S.-owned corporations like the United Fruit Company bought up so much land that they effectively controlled the governments of Honduras and Costa Rica. And from 1901 to 1920, U.S. Marines landed over 20 times under the guise of establishing more friendly environments for democracy and American business. But of course, Teddy didn't stop at Latin America. He set his sights on peace across Asia as well. First, he negotiated a gentleman's agreement with Japan. You see, Japanese immigrants were becoming more numerous along the West Coast, and I think you know how the West Coast felt about Asian immigrants. See the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1884. And Japan also wasn't very happy about losing its labor force to the United States, who was becoming its growing rival in the Pacific. Remember that Japan at this time was Meiji restorationing and trying to catch up to the industrial West. So they wanted these immigrants to stay and work for them. These tensions flared up in 1906 when the San Francisco School Board declared that they would segregate students by race, placing Asian students in their own separate but equal schools. Remember that Jim Crow-style policies, while concentrated most clearly in the South against Black Americans, were popping up all over the country to maintain white supremacy in the face of whichever non-white community was believed to be threatening the status quo. On the West Coast, white people believed that was Asian Americans. So Teddy negotiated an informal deal, a gentleman's agreement with the Japanese government. Teddy would personally see to it that San Francisco revoked its segregation order if Japan would stop giving its citizens visas to emigrate to the United States. Immigration from Japan would slow, which is what white citizens on the West Coast wanted, but the ones who already lived there wouldn't be formally discriminated against. and everything was resolved, and Japanese Americans on the West Coast will never have any issues again. This agreement came on the heels of Teddy's greatest international achievement. You know, negotiating a peace treaty to end the Russo-Japanese War? What? What's Teddy doing, acting as a therapist for Russia and Japan? Well, he saw that if the war kept going on, they were fighting over land in Manchuria, by the way, aren't they always? He saw that Japan was going to demolish Russia, leading to a massive imbalance of power in the Pacific. And we had just gotten some territory in the Pacific. Oh, hey, Philippines and Guam. And if there was going to be an imbalance of power, well, we wanted to be the ones in power. So Teddy invited the Tsar of Russia and the Emperor of Japan to New Hampshire. As you do, he helped them sign a treaty and then received the Nobel Peace Prize. Man, this guy just doesn't quit. But Teddy was way more than a trust-busting outdoorsman. He was also progressive on topics related to social justice and civil rights. Now, could he have done way more to support Black Americans as president? Sure. But compared to every other president who came before him, besides Lincoln, Teddy did use his position to make headway for the rights of Black Americans. For example, Minnie Cox had been postmaster of a small town in Mississippi on and off for decades. She was the first Black woman to be postmaster anywhere in the country. And this was a really desirable civil service job. But as Reconstruction-era protections faded away and Jim Crow rose in the South, white residents signed a petition calling on her to resign. In the fall of 1902, future Mississippi Governor and U.S. Senator James Vardaman wrote editorials condemning white residents for, quote, tolerating a Negro wench as a postmaster. He argued that if necessary, quote, every Negro in the state will be lynched to maintain white supremacy. Facing increasing threats with no protection from local law enforcement, she stepped down. And after hearing about her mistreatment, Teddy Roosevelt refused to accept her resignation and ordered that all mail service in the city should be halted until she was allowed back on her job to finish out the term. Now, she was fearing for her safety, so Minnie Cox moved away, but Teddy stuck to his guns, and the Indianola post office was closed until Minnie's term expired the following year. She eventually moved back to the town where she and her husband opened one of the earliest Black-owned banks in the state of Mississippi. TR was also the first president to formally entertain a Black American as an official personal guest at the White House residence, which is insane when you think about it. Like, Lincoln had met with Frederick Douglass on multiple occasions, but this was the first time that a U.S. president invited a Black person as a personal guest rather than just a political meeting. Whoa. After he dined with Booker T. Washington in the White House, the backlash was so severe that many worried Teddy had ruined his career. But he confided in a letter that he was glad he did it, and that the negative response was just proof in his mind that it was a good thing and a necessary thing for him to have done. Now, should we celebrate Teddy as a civil rights icon for having dinner with a Black man? No. But again, compared with others, especially outright racist future President Woodrow Wilson, it was at least a step in the right direction and a show of support. Now, because Teddy's a conundrum, some of his reactions to civil rights abuses were muddled at best. For example, in 1906, a group of Black troops in Brownsville, Texas were accused of killing a white person. The War Department recommended they be dismissed because none of them would confess, but Teddy seemed to support the Black troops. That is, until after the November election. Yep, Republican candidates got hundreds of thousands of Black votes, and then Teddy dismissed all 167 Black soldiers with no pensions, so that's not great. But in general, Teddy was ahead of his time. He was also a strong supporter of a woman's right to vote, leading to one historian calling him, quote, the great male feminist of his period. Ooh, I love me a male feminist. More on that in a few episodes. Now, after almost 2 full terms, remember his first was taking over for McKinley, Teddy thought he would step out of the limelight and let someone else lead. You know, as long as he could personally choose who that person would be. And as long as that person did exactly what Teddy Roosevelt wanted him to do. It's gonna be a tough road for Taft. To be continued. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe, and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.